The cowboy appeared on her porch at dawn, his boots making no sound on the weathered boards, and Margaret Miller knew that either her life was about to get harder or someone had finally decided to take her side. It was September 1881 in Malad City, Idaho, and the morning air carried the sharp bite of autumn coming down from the mountains. Margaret stood inside her small ranch house, one hand gripping the rifle she kept by the door, watching through the window as the stranger settled himself against the porch railing like he had every right to be there. He was tall, lean in the way working men got when they spent more time in the saddle than at a supper table, and his hat was pulled low enough that she could not see much of his face in the pre-dawn darkness. She pushed open the door with her boot, leveling the rifle at him without hesitation. "You have got about 5 seconds to tell me why you are on my property before I decide you are another one of Henderson's men trying to scare me off." The cowboy turned slowly, keeping his hands visible and away from the gun belt slung low on his hips. When he tilted his head back enough for her to see his face, she was surprised by how young he was, maybe 25 or 26, with eyes that looked steady and honest in the growing light. "Name is Yates Owens, madam. I am not here to scare you. I am here to make sure nobody else does either." Margaret did not lower the rifle. "I did not hire any protection." "No, madam, you did not." He shifted his weight, and she noticed he favored his left leg slightly, like an old injury that still troubled him in the cold mornings. "But I have been watching what is happening to your place, and it is not right. Figured you could use someone on your side. And what makes you think I need help from a stranger?" Her voice came out sharper than she intended, but 6 months of fighting to keep her land had worn away most of her patience for pleasantries. Yates was quiet for a moment, studying her with those steady eyes. "Because 3 nights ago, someone cut your fence line and scattered 40 head of your cattle. 2 weeks before that, they poisoned your well. And last month they burned down your hay barn right before winter." He paused, letting the words settle between them. "I think you need help because you are fighting this alone, and the men trying to run you off are not going to stop until you are gone or dead." The accuracy of his accounting made her stomach tighten. She had told herself she could handle it, that she could rebuild and repair and outlast their cruelty. But hearing it laid out like that, one disaster after another, made the situation feel more desperate than she wanted to admit. "Why do you care?" she asked, finally lowering the rifle a fraction. "Because I spent 5 years watching powerful men crush people who could not fight back, and I got tired of it." His voice was quiet but firm. "I am not looking for pay. I am not looking to take over your land or tell you what to do with it. I just want to help someone who deserves it for once." Margaret wanted to send him away. She had learned the hard way that trusting people, especially men, often ended in disappointment or worse. But the exhaustion in her bones and the fear she would not admit to anyone made her hesitate. She had been running this ranch alone since her father died 8 months ago, and every day felt like pushing a boulder uphill while people threw rocks at her back. "You can sleep in the barn," she said finally. "But if I catch you stealing, lying, or causing trouble, you will be gone before you can blink." Yates nodded, a small smile touching the corner of his mouth. "Fair enough, madam. And stop calling me madam. Makes me feel like somebody's grandmother. My name is Margaret." "All right, Margaret." The way he said her name was respectful, not familiar, and she appreciated that. "I will earn my keep. You will not regret this." She wanted to tell him she already regretted it, that letting anyone into her world right now felt like opening a door to more hurt. Instead, she turned back into the house and shut the door, listening to his footsteps cross the porch and head toward the barn. The sun was fully up by the time she finished her coffee and went outside to start the day's work. Yates was already in the corral, working with one of her horses that had been too skittish for her to ride. He moved with the easy confidence of someone who had spent his whole life around animals, his voice low and soothing as he ran his hand along the mare's neck. Margaret watched from the fence, impressed despite herself. The mare, a 3-year-old paint that had been abused by a previous owner, usually shied away from everyone, but she stood still for Yates, her ears forward and relaxed. "She been hurt bad?" Yates asked without looking up. "Previous owner beat her. I got her cheap at auction because nobody else wanted to deal with her. She will come around." He continued his slow, patient work. "Just needs to learn that not everyone is going to hurt her." Margaret wondered if he was still talking about the horse. By midday, word had spread through Malad City that Margaret Miller had hired a man. She knew this because Samuel Henderson himself rode up to her property line with 2 of his sons, all 3 of them sitting their horses like they owned the world. Henderson was in his 50s, thick through the middle with a face that had been weathered by sun and hardened by greed. He owned the largest ranch in the valley, and he had made it clear from the day Margaret's father died that he intended to buy her land for a fraction of what it was worth. "Heard you got yourself some help, Margaret," Henderson called out, not bothering to dismount. "That is a smart move for a woman in your position. Why do not you send him out here so we can have a talk man to man?" Margaret walked to the property line, very aware that Yates had stopped working and was watching from the corral. "If you have something to say, Henderson, you can say it to me. This is my land." Henderson's smile did not reach his eyes. "Now, Margaret, we have been over this. Your daddy ran this place into the ground before he died, and you are just making it worse. A woman has got no business trying to run a cattle ranch. You should take my offer and move into town, find yourself a husband, live a proper life." "My answer has not changed. The ranch is not for sale." "You are being stubborn and foolish." His voice hardened. "People around here do not like the disruption you are causing. They want this settled, and they want it settled soon." "What people?" Margaret demanded. "You mean the other ranchers you have bullied into backing your play?" "The shopkeepers who will not sell to me because you threaten their business. Those people." Henderson's jaw tightened. "You watch your mouth, girl. You are making enemies you cannot afford to have." "She has got at least one friend she can afford to have," Yates said, walking up to stand beside Margaret. He did not touch her, did not step in front of her like some men would have, but his presence was solid and reassuring. "And I would think real careful about what you do next, Henderson, because I am watching every move you make." Henderson's eyes narrowed as he studied Yates. "I do not know you, boy. That is all right. You will get to know me if you keep causing problems." The 2 men stared at each other for a long moment, and Margaret could feel the tension crackling between them. Finally, Henderson jerked his horse's head around. "This is not over," he said, directing the words at Margaret. "You are going to regret being so stubborn." They watched the 3 Hendersons ride away, and Margaret realized her hands were shaking. She shoved them into her pockets before Yates could notice. "He is not going to stop," she said quietly. "He wants this land because it has got the best water rights in the valley. Without access to my creek, his herd is going to struggle every summer. He will keep pushing until I break or he breaks me. Then we make sure you do not break." Yates turned to look at her, and she was struck by the determination in his face. "You did not give up when they burned your barn or poisoned your well. You are not going to give up now. You do not know me well enough to make that assumption. Maybe not. But I know what I see, and I see someone who fights. That is good enough for me." Over the next week, Yates proved himself more valuable than Margaret wanted to admit. He repaired the fence line that had been cut, working from dawn until dark to string new wire and set new posts. He helped her move the cattle to better grazing land, and spent his evenings working with the skittish mare, until the horse started to trust him. But more than the physical labor, he was someone to talk to at the end of the day. They would sit on the porch after supper, watching the sun set behind the mountains, and Margaret found herself telling him things she had not told anyone else. "My father bought this land 15 years ago," she said one evening, her voice soft in the gathering darkness. Everyone told him he was crazy, that the land was too rough and the water too unreliable. But he made it work. He built this place from nothing, and he taught me everything he knew about ranching because I was all he had. She paused, the familiar ache of grief tightening her chest. When he got sick last winter, the vultures started circling before he was even in the ground. Henderson made his first offer 3 days after the funeral. "Your father would be proud of how hard you are fighting to keep this place," Yates said. "I am not so sure." Maybe he would tell me to be practical, to take the money and start over somewhere else. "You do not believe that." She did not, but it was easier to voice the doubts than to admit how terrified she was of failing. "Tell me about you," she said, changing the subject. "You know all my sad stories. It is only fair I hear some of yours." Yates was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough around the edges. "I grew up in Texas. My father had a small ranch, nothing fancy, but it was ours. When I was 20, a bigger rancher decided he wanted our land. He used every dirty trick you can imagine to try to force us out. My father refused to sell, so one night they came to the house and set it on fire." He stopped, and Margaret could see the muscles in his jaw working. "My parents and my little sister were inside. I was out checking the herd. By the time I got back, it was too late." "Yates," Margaret breathed, her heart breaking for him. "I am so sorry. I spent 3 years tracking down the men responsible. Got justice for my family, but it did not bring them back. After that, I just drifted. Worked ranches all over, never staying in one place too long. When I rode through Malad City a couple of weeks ago and heard about what was happening to you, I knew I could not just ride away. I could not watch it happen again and do nothing." Margaret reached over and took his hand, squeezing it gently. His fingers were calloused and strong, and they wrapped around hers with a tenderness that made her breath catch. "Thank you for staying," she said. "Thank you for letting me." They sat like that for a while, hands linked in the darkness, and Margaret felt something shift between them. It was not just gratitude or shared struggle anymore. It was something deeper, something that scared and thrilled her in equal measure. The attacks continued, but they were different now. Whoever was behind them seemed more cautious, more calculating. Margaret found dead coyotes on her porch, their throats slit, a clear warning. Someone shot at her while she was riding the fence line, the bullet passing close enough that she heard it whistle by her ear. Her cattle started getting sick, and when the veterinarian came out from town, he found arsenic in their feed through it all. Yates was there. He started sleeping in the house instead of the barn, taking the spare bedroom so he could respond faster if anything happened. He taught her how to watch for signs of intruders and convinced her to start varying her routine so she would be harder to track. And he stood on her porch every morning at dawn, a visible reminder to anyone watching that Margaret was not alone anymore. The townspeople were divided about Margaret's situation. Some of them sympathized with her, but they were afraid to speak up against Henderson and the other powerful ranchers who supported him. Others genuinely believed that a woman had no business running a ranch, and that Margaret should accept Henderson's offer and move on. The one person who was openly supportive was Clara Jensen, who owned the boarding house in town. Clara was a widow in her 60s who had been friends with Margaret's father, and she made a point of inviting Margaret and Yates to Sunday dinner whenever they came to town for supplies. "You are causing quite a stir, you know," Clara said one Sunday afternoon as they sat in her dining room eating roast chicken and potatoes. "Half the town thinks you are being foolishly stubborn, and the other half thinks you are brave for standing up to Henderson. What do you think?" Margaret asked. Clara smiled. "I think your father raised you right, and you have got every right to keep what is yours. I also think Henderson is a greedy fool who is going to push too hard one of these days and find himself on the wrong side of the law." "The law," Margaret said bitterly. "The sheriff is Henderson's cousin. He is not going to do anything to stop what is happening." "Then you do what you have been doing," Clara said firmly. "You keep fighting and you do not let them break you." After dinner, as Margaret and Yates were preparing to head back to the ranch, Clara pulled Margaret aside. "That young man of yours," she said quietly, "he is a good one. I can see it in how he looks at you." Margaret felt her cheeks flush. "He is not my young man. He is just helping me with the ranch." Clara gave her a knowing look. "If you believe that, then you are not as smart as I thought you were. That boy is in love with you, Margaret, and unless I am reading you wrong, you feel the same way about him." Margaret wanted to deny it, but the words stuck in her throat. The truth was that somewhere between the long days working side by side and the quiet evenings on the porch, she had fallen for Yates. She loved his steadiness, his strength, the way he treated her as an equal instead of someone who needed to be managed. She loved how gentle he was with the animals and how fierce he was in defending her. She loved the sound of his laugh and the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. But admitting it felt dangerous. Loving someone meant giving them the power to hurt you, and Margaret had been hurt enough. That night, as they drove the wagon back to the ranch under a sky full of stars, Yates broke the comfortable silence. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Why did you never marry? You are beautiful, smart, and tougher than most men I know. Seems like you would have had plenty of offers." Margaret kept her eyes on the road ahead. "I had a few offers. None of them were from men who wanted a partner. They wanted someone to cook their meals and raise their children and keep quiet while the men made all the decisions. That was never going to be me. What would you want, if you could have it any way you wanted?" She thought about it, trying to put into words something she had never really articulated before. "I would want someone who sees me as an equal, someone who respects that I have my own dreams and my own strength. Someone who would stand beside me, not in front of me or behind me, but right beside me as we build something together." She glanced at him, her heart pounding. "What about you? You ever think about settling down?" "I used to think I could not," Yates admitted. "After what happened to my family, I thought the only thing I was good for was drifting and working. But lately, I have been thinking maybe I was wrong. Maybe I could have something more if I found the right person to build it with." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning, but neither of them was quite brave enough to take the next step. Instead, they rode the rest of the way in silence, the tension humming like a plucked string. The breaking point came in late October. Margaret woke in the middle of the night to the sound of horses and men's voices outside. She grabbed her rifle and rushed to the window, her heart slamming against her ribs. In the moonlight, she could see at least 6 men on horseback surrounding the house. Yates appeared in her doorway, his gun already drawn. "Stay away from the windows," he said quietly. "Margaret Miller." A voice shouted from outside. She recognized it as belonging to Cole Henderson, Samuel's oldest son. "You have got one last chance to do this the easy way. Sign over your deed to my father, and we will let you and your hired man ride out of here alive." Margaret looked at Yates, her mind racing. "There are too many of them. I have been in worse situations." His voice was calm, steady. "But I need to know something before this goes any further. If we make it through tonight, are you going to keep fighting? Because if you are ready to walk away, we can do that. I will get you out of here safely and you can start over somewhere else. You think I should give up? The question came out sharper than she intended. No. He crossed the room to stand in front of her, and even in the dim light, she could see the intensity in his eyes. I think you should fight for this place with everything you have got, but I need to know that is what you want, because I am prepared to stand with you no matter what that means. I just need to hear you say it. I am not giving up, Margaret said fiercely. This is my land, my home, and I will die before I let Henderson take it from me. Yates smiled, and it was the kind of smile that made her stomach flip. That is what I was hoping you would say. We are not asking again, Cole Henderson shouted. You have got 60 seconds to come out here and sign those papers, or we are coming in to get you. Yates moved to the window, careful to stay out of the direct line of sight. I count 6 of them, he murmured. They are spread out pretty good, but they are also making themselves easy targets if we can get them to focus on one place. What are you thinking? I am thinking we need help, and we need it fast. How far is the nearest neighbor who might actually come if we sent up a signal? The Coopers are about 3 miles east. Jim Cooper was friends with my father, but he has been too afraid of Henderson to speak up for me. Being afraid and being unwilling to help are 2 different things. If we can convince these men that reinforcements are coming, they might back off long enough for us to actually get help. Margaret thought fast. There is dynamite in the barn. My father used it for clearing stumps. If we could set off a blast, it would be loud enough for the Coopers to hear, and Henderson's men might think we have got more firepower than we actually do. Can you get to the barn from here without being seen? There is a root cellar that connects the house to the barn. My father built it in case we ever had to deal with storms or Indian raids. Then here is what we are going to do. Yates outlined his plan quickly, and Margaret listened with a mixture of terror and admiration. It was risky, possibly suicidal, but it was better than sitting in the house waiting to be burned out or killed. They made their way through the root cellar, the narrow tunnel damp and smelling of earth. Margaret's hands shook as she gathered the dynamite and fuses, but she forced herself to stay focused. She could fall apart later after they survived. Yates positioned the dynamite at the far end of the barn, away from the animals, and set a long fuse. When this goes off, it is going to bring them running to investigate. I need you to get back to the house and be ready to shoot anyone who tries to come through the front door. Can you do that? Yes. Her voice was steadier than she felt. But what about you? I am going to be the distraction. Once they realize what happened, I am going to draw their fire away from the house and give you a chance to hold them off until help arrives. That is a terrible plan. You will get yourself killed. You have got a better idea, she did not, and that terrified her. But before she could argue further, Yates pulled her close and kissed her. It was hard and desperate and full of everything they had not said to each other, and when he pulled back, Margaret felt like her heart was going to pound out of her chest. I have wanted to do that for weeks, Yates said, his voice rough. And I will be damned if I am going to die tonight without letting you know how I feel about you. You are not going to die, Margaret said fiercely. You are going to set off that dynamite, and then you are going to get back to the house, and we are going to fight these bastards off together. And when it is over, we are going to have a long talk about what happens next. He smiled, that same heart-stopping smile that made her want to grab onto him and never let go. I like the sound of that. They moved quickly, Yates lighting the fuse while Margaret hurried back through the tunnel. She was barely back in the house when the explosion ripped through the night, a massive boom that shook the walls and sent the Henderson men shouting in confusion. Margaret positioned herself at the front window, her rifle ready. She could see men running toward the barn, their attention diverted exactly as Yates had planned. Then she saw him, moving fast and low through the shadows, firing shots at the men to keep them focused on him and away from the house. One of the Henderson men went down, clutching his leg. Another dove for cover behind a water trough. Cole Henderson was shouting orders, trying to regain control of the situation, but it was clear they had not expected this level of resistance. A shot rang out, and Margaret's heart stopped as she saw Yates stumble. But he kept moving, kept firing, and she realized he had only tripped on the uneven ground. She wanted to run out there and help him, but she knew that would only make things worse. Instead, she started firing at the men closest to the house, forcing them to split their attention between Yates and her. The battle seemed to last forever, though it was probably only minutes. Then Margaret heard something that made hope surge in her chest. More horses, more voices, coming fast from the east. The Coopers had heard the explosion and were coming to investigate. "Fall back," Cole Henderson shouted, realizing that the odds had shifted. "Fall back now." The Henderson men retreated in disorder, two of them riding double because one horse had been shot out from under its rider. Margaret kept her rifle trained on them until they disappeared into the darkness, and only then did she lower the gun and run outside. Yates was limping toward the house, blood soaking through his pants leg. Margaret reached him just as he started to sway, catching him before he could fall. "I am all right," he said, though his face was pale. "Just grazed me." "You are not all right, you stubborn fool." She could hear the tears in her own voice and did not care. "You could have been killed, but I was not." He touched her face with his free hand, his fingers gentle despite the blood and gunpowder staining them. "We are both alive, Margaret. We won." Jim Cooper and his two adult sons rode up, rifles at the ready. Jim was a big man in his 40s with a weathered face and kind eyes. "Margaret, are you hurt?" "No, but Yates is. Can you help me get him inside?" Between the four of them, they got Yates into the house and onto the kitchen table. Margaret worked with shaking hands to clean and bandage the bullet wound, which was indeed a graze but deep enough to need stitches. Clara had taught her basic medical care years ago, and she had never been more grateful for that knowledge. While she worked, Jim Cooper stood nearby, his hat in his hands. "I owe you an apology, Margaret. I should have stood up for you weeks ago when this all started. I let fear make me a coward, and I am ashamed of that." "You are here now," Margaret said, her attention focused on Yates. "That is what matters. Henderson is going to face consequences for this," Jim said firmly. "This was not just intimidation anymore. This was attempted murder. My boys and I will testify to what we saw, and I will make sure the territorial marshal hears about this. Sheriff Thompson might be Henderson's cousin, but he does not have the final say in matters like this." Over the next few days, the tide began to turn. Jim Cooper made good on his promise, riding to the territorial capital to file a formal complaint with the marshal's office. Other ranchers who had been quietly sympathetic to Margaret's situation, but afraid to speak up, started coming forward with their own stories of Henderson's bullying and intimidation. The shopkeepers in town began selling to Margaret again, and the minister gave a sermon about standing up for what was right even when it was difficult. Samuel Henderson and his sons were arrested and charged with attempted murder, arson, destruction of property, and a host of other crimes. The evidence against them was overwhelming, especially with multiple witnesses willing to testify. Henderson tried to use his influence to make the charges disappear, but the territorial marshal was not a man who could be bought or intimidated. Through it all, Yates recovered from his injury with Margaret tending to him. She found herself looking forward to the hours she spent sitting with him, changing his bandages and bringing him meals. They talked about everything and nothing, learning each other's stories and dreams and fears. "I have been thinking," Yates said one afternoon as he sat on the porch, his leg propped up and healing well. "When I am back on my feet, I want to help you rebuild that barn and fix up the fences properly, and maybe add on to the house a bit if you are agreeable to it." "That sounds like you are planning to stick around for a while," Margaret said, her heart beating faster. "I am planning to stick around permanently if you will have me." He reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "I love you, Margaret. I think I started falling for you the first morning I stood on this porch, and you pointed a rifle at me. You are the strongest, bravest, most incredible woman I have ever met, and I want to build a life with you. Not because I think you need me to take care of you, but because I cannot imagine my life without you in it." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes, but they were good tears, happy tears. "I love you too," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "I fought it for a long time because I was scared, but I love you, Yates. I love how you see me as an equal. I love how you fight beside me instead of trying to fight for me. I love how gentle you are and how fierce you are and how you make me feel like I can face anything as long as you are with me." He pulled her close and kissed her, and this kiss was different from the desperate one in the barn. This kiss was a promise, a beginning, a future unfolding between them. "Marry me," Yates said when they finally pulled apart. "Let me be your partner in every sense of the word. We will run this ranch together, build it into something even better than your father dreamed. We will face whatever comes side by side, and we will make a good life here." "Yes," Margaret said, laughing through her tears. "Yes, I will marry you." They were married in November, just a few weeks later, in a small ceremony at Clara's boarding house. Jim Cooper and his family came, along with a growing number of townspeople who had decided that Margaret and Yates represented the kind of courage and integrity that Malad City needed more of. Clara cried through the entire ceremony, and afterward she pulled them both into a fierce hug. "I am so happy for you both," she said. "You are going to have a wonderful life together." The trial of Samuel Henderson and his sons took place in December. The evidence was damning, and the jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all charges. Henderson was sentenced to 10 years in the territorial prison, while his sons received shorter sentences but were banned from owning property in Idaho for the rest of their lives. With Henderson gone, his ranch was sold to pay his legal fees and restitution to his victims. Margaret and Yates were able to buy back the water rights that Henderson had tried to steal, securing their ranch's future. They also bought several additional acres of land, expanding their operation and hiring a few ranch hands to help with the work. Life settled into a rhythm that was both challenging and deeply satisfying. Margaret and Yates worked side by side every day, managing the cattle, repairing buildings, and slowly transforming the ranch into something truly special. They added a proper barn to replace the one that had been destroyed, built a new bunkhouse for their workers, and expanded the main house to include a larger kitchen and a proper bedroom. But it was not just the physical improvements that made their life together special. It was the quiet moments on the porch at sunset, the laughter over breakfast, the way they moved together with the ease of two people who understood each other completely. It was the way Yates would find her in the barn and steal a kiss when no one was looking, the way Margaret would rest her head on his shoulder when they sat together in the evenings, the way they talked through every decision and dream as true partners. In the spring of 1882, Margaret discovered she was pregnant. She was nervous about telling Yates, worried that he might suddenly become overprotective or try to stop her from working on the ranch. But when she finally told him one evening after supper, his reaction was everything she could have hoped for. "We are going to have a baby?" he asked, his eyes wide with wonder. "We are." She watched his face carefully. I am still going to work on the ranch, though. I am not going to spend the next 6 months sitting around doing nothing." Yates laughed and pulled her into his arms. "I would never expect you to. I fell in love with a rancher, Margaret. I am not going to try to turn you into something you are not. We will figure this out together, just like we figure everything else out." Their first child, a son they named William after Margaret's father, was born in November 1882. He was healthy and strong, with Margaret's dark hair and Yates's steady eyes. Margaret was back on a horse within a month, William strapped to her back in a carrier that Clara had helped her make, and Yates simply shook his head and smiled when the other ranchers expressed their shock. "That is my wife," he would say with obvious pride. "She does not know how to do anything halfway." They had their challenges, of course. There were hard winters and dry summers, sick cattle and broken equipment. Margaret's independent streak sometimes clashed with Yates's protective instincts, and they had their share of arguments. But they always worked through it, always came back to the fundamental respect and love that formed the foundation of their relationship. In 1884, they had a second child, a daughter they named Rose. She was as fierce and determined as her mother, walking early and constantly getting into mischief. William adored his little sister, and Yates loved to come in from working to find his children climbing all over him. The ranch continued to grow and prosper. Word spread about the quality of their cattle and the integrity with which they conducted business. Other ranchers, seeing how well Margaret and Yates worked together as equal partners, started treating their own wives with more respect. Clara joked that Margaret and Yates were starting a revolution, and maybe she was not entirely wrong. In 1886, they hired a young couple to help manage the day-to-day operations of the ranch. Samuel and Catherine Brown had been farmers in Kansas who lost everything to a tornado and were looking for a fresh start. Margaret and Yates gave them jobs and a small house on the property, and the Browns became not just employees but friends. With more help on the ranch, Margaret and Yates found they had more time to spend with their children and each other. They took family trips into the mountains, teaching William and Rose about the land and the animals. They hosted Sunday dinners at their ranch, becoming the social center for a growing community of ranchers who believed in fairness and hard work. Yates never stopped standing on the porch every morning at dawn. It had become his ritual, a quiet moment to watch the sun rise over the land they had fought so hard to keep. More often than not, Margaret would join him, bringing 2 cups of coffee and settling beside him in comfortable silence. "Do you ever think about what your life would have been like if you had just ridden through Malad City that day?" Margaret asked one morning in the spring of 1887. "If you had not stopped to help me." Yates wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "I think about it sometimes. I think I would have kept drifting, never finding a place to call home, never finding someone to love. I would have survived, but I would not have lived. Not really. I used to think I was fine on my own," Margaret admitted. "I thought needing someone meant being weak. But loving you did not make me weaker. It made me stronger." "We made each other stronger," Yates corrected. "That is what a real partnership does." They stood there as the sun climbed higher, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. The ranch spread out before them, beautiful and thriving, a testament to everything they had built together. In the distance, they could hear William and Rose laughing as they played near the barn, their children's joy a sound that never got old. By 1890, their ranch was one of the most successful in Idaho. They had expanded their herd to over 500 head of cattle, built a reputation for fair dealing that brought buyers from across the territory, and employed a dozen people who they treated like family. The neighboring ranchers no longer questioned Margaret's right to run her ranch or her capability to do so. She had proven herself beyond any doubt, and Yates had proven that a man could support a strong woman without diminishing his own strength. Margaret was pregnant again, expecting their third child in the fall. This pregnancy felt different somehow, more relaxed and joyful. She was not worried about proving herself anymore. She knew who she was and what she was capable of, and she had a partner who supported her completely. One evening in August, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Yates said, "You know, I have been thinking about expanding into horses. There is a good market for well-trained working horses, and we have got the land and the resources to do it right." Margaret smiled. "I have been thinking the same thing. Remember that mare you worked with when you first arrived, the one who had been abused, of course. She turned out to be one of the best horses we have got. I was thinking we could specialize in taking difficult horses and rehabilitating them. There are a lot of animals out there that just need patience and understanding to become incredible partners. We could build a reputation for that kind of work." Yates reached over and took her hand. "You know what I love about you? You are always thinking 3 steps ahead, always looking for the next challenge. You never settle for good enough." "I learned that from you," Margaret said. "You never gave up on me, even when I was difficult and stubborn and pushing you away. You saw something worth fighting for and you fought for it. How could I do anything less with our ranch and our life together?" Their third child, a son they named Thomas, was born in October 1890. He was a quiet baby, content to watch the world with serious eyes that reminded Margaret of her father. William, now 7, took his role as big brother very seriously, while Rose, at 6, was more interested in continuing her adventures than helping with the new baby. The years continued to pass in a blur of hard work, laughter, and love. They had their struggles, certainly. There was a terrible winter in 1893 that killed a portion of their herd. Rose broke her arm falling from a horse when she was 9, giving Margaret and Yates a terrible scare. William wanted to go to college in the East, which was difficult for Margaret to accept, though she ultimately supported his dream. Through it all, Margaret and Yates remained each other's strongest support. They still worked side by side on the ranch, though they delegated more responsibilities as their children grew and their operation expanded. They still sat on the porch every evening, talking about their day and making plans for the future. They still found time to steal kisses in the barn and hold hands under the dinner table when their children were not looking. In 1895, Samuel Henderson was released from prison, a broken man who quietly left Idaho and was never heard from again. His sons had scattered across the West, their reputations ruined by their father's crimes. The land that had once been the Henderson Ranch was now divided among several smaller ranchers, creating a more diverse and cooperative community. Margaret and Yates were in their 40s now, their hair starting to show threads of silver, their faces lined by years of sun and wind. But they were happy in a deep, settled way that came from building something real and lasting. Their ranch was thriving, their children were growing into good people, and their love for each other had only deepened with time. William went off to college in 1896, studying business and agriculture with plans to return and help modernize the ranch. Rose, true to her nature, announced that she wanted to be a veterinarian, one of the first women in the territory to pursue such a profession. Thomas, quieter than his siblings, showed a remarkable talent for working with horses, particularly the difficult ones that Margaret and Yates had started specializing in. In 1898, on a crisp autumn morning much like the one when Yates had first appeared on her porch, Margaret stood watching the sunrise with her husband's arm around her. They had been married for 16 years, and she loved him more now than she had on their wedding day. "Do you remember what you said to me that first morning?" Margaret asked. When I pointed a rifle at you and demanded to know why you were on my property, Yates smiled. I said I was not there to scare you. I was there to make sure nobody else did either. You kept that promise. You have been keeping it every day for 17 years now. It was not a hard promise to keep, Yates said. I was not just protecting you, Margaret, I was protecting us, the life we could build together, the family we could have. I knew from that first moment that you were someone special, someone worth standing beside no matter what came. Margaret turned to face him, reaching up to touch his weathered face. I never thanked you properly for not giving up on me, for seeing past my stubbornness and fear to the person underneath, for loving me the way I needed to be loved. You do not need to thank me for loving you. It is the easiest thing I have ever done. They kissed, and it still felt the way it had that first time in the barn, full of promise and passion and partnership. After all these years, after everything they had been through together, Margaret still felt her heart skip a beat when Yates looked at her with love in his eyes. Their children grew and had children of their own. William returned from college with a wife, a sweet woman named Elizabeth who fell in love with ranch life and became Margaret's close friend and partner in expanding their operation. Rose did indeed become a veterinarian, though she had to fight twice as hard as any man to be taken seriously. She eventually opened her own practice in Malad City, becoming renowned throughout the territory for her skill with animals. Thomas married a neighboring rancher's daughter and started his own small horse ranch on land that Margaret and Yates gave him as a wedding present. By 1905, Margaret and Yates were grandparents 5 times over, with more grandchildren on the way. The ranch they had fought so hard to keep had grown into an empire, employing dozens of people and spanning thousands of acres. But more importantly, it had become a symbol of what was possible when two people worked together as true equals, respecting each other's strengths and supporting each other through weaknesses. On a summer evening in 1908, Margaret and Yates celebrated their 26th wedding anniversary with a party that brought together 3 generations of family and friends. The ranch was full of laughter and music, children running through the gardens that Margaret had planted over the years, adults sharing stories and remembering the hard early days. Clara Jensen, now in her 80s but still sharp as a tack, pulled Margaret and Yates aside during the party. I want you both to know how proud I am of you, she said, her eyes bright with tears. When I first met you, Margaret, you were so young and so determined and so alone. And Yates, you were this quiet cowboy with sad eyes and a good heart. I had hoped you would find your way to each other, but I never imagined you would build something this beautiful. You have not just created a successful ranch, you have created a legacy of love and partnership that will inspire people for generations. Margaret hugged the older woman tightly. We could not have done it without you. You were the first person who believed in me when everyone else thought I should give up. I believed in you because I saw your father's strength in you, Clara said, but you surpassed even his dreams for this place. He would be so proud of the woman you became and the family you built. As the party continued into the evening, Margaret found herself standing on the porch, looking out at the land she loved. Yates came to stand beside her, as he had done countless times over the years, and wrapped his arm around her waist. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "I am thinking about that morning you showed up on my porch," Margaret said. "I was so scared and so angry and so alone. I had convinced myself that I could handle everything by myself, that accepting help was the same as admitting defeat. And then you appeared, this stranger who had no reason to care about me or my problems, and you offered to stand beside me. You changed my entire life that day." "You changed mine too," Yates said softly. "I was drifting before I met you, just existing but not really living. You gave me a reason to put down roots, to build something permanent. You gave me a family and a home and a purpose. You gave me everything." They stood together as the stars came out, watching their children and grandchildren celebrate around them. The ranch spread out in all directions, beautiful and prosperous and full of life. It was everything Margaret's father had dreamed of and more, a testament to hard work, determination, and the power of two people who loved each other completely. In 1910, Margaret and Yates decided to gradually hand over the day-to-day operations of the ranch to William and Elizabeth. They were both in their 50s now, still strong and capable but ready to spend more time with their grandchildren and each other. They remained involved in the major decisions and still worked on the ranch when they wanted to. But they no longer carried the weight of responsibility they had borne for so many years. Yates still stood on the porch every morning at dawn, a ritual he had never broken in nearly 30 years. More often than not, Margaret joined him, and they would watch the sunrise together in comfortable silence, their hands linked and their hearts at peace. "You have any regrets?" Margaret asked him one morning in the spring of 1912. Yates thought about it for a long moment before answering. "I regret that my family did not live to see this, to meet you and our children. I regret that it took tragedy to bring me to the place where I needed to be. But the life we have built together, our children, our grandchildren, this ranch, I do not regret a single day of it. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Margaret. You always will be." "You are the best thing that ever happened to me too," Margaret said, leaning her head on his shoulder. "I thought I was strong enough to face the world alone, but I was wrong. Real strength is not about doing everything yourself. It is about finding someone who makes you stronger, who stands beside you and lifts you up when you need it. You taught me that." They stood together as the sun climbed higher, painting the sky in brilliant colors. The ranch awakened around them, their family beginning their day, carrying on the legacy that Margaret and Yates had built through years of hard work, love, and partnership. In the years that followed, they watched their grandchildren grow, celebrated more weddings and births, weathered losses and challenges as a family. The ranch continued to prosper under William's management, incorporating new methods and technologies while staying true to the values that Margaret and Yates had instilled. Rose's veterinary practice became so successful that she eventually opened a second location in Pocatello, with one of her daughters joining her in the business. Thomas's horse ranch became known throughout the region for producing exceptional working horses, particularly for ranchers who needed intelligent, steady animals. Margaret and Yates spent their later years traveling when they could, visiting places they had never seen when they were younger and consumed with building the ranch. But they always returned to Malad City, to the land they had fought so hard to keep, to the porch where Yates had first stood all those years ago. In 1920, they celebrated their 38th wedding anniversary surrounded by their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. The ranch threw a massive party, inviting everyone in the county to celebrate not just a marriage but a love story that had become legendary in the community. Margaret, now in her early 60s with silver hair and a face lined by years of laughter and hard work, stood to give a speech. "When I was a young woman, newly alone and facing what seemed like impossible odds, a cowboy appeared on my porch one morning. The neighbors wanted me gone. They tried everything they could to drive me away. But that cowboy stood on my porch every morning, a silent reminder that I was not alone, that someone believed in me and was willing to fight beside me. That cowboy became my husband, my partner, my best friend, and the love of my life. Yates, you gave me everything I never knew I needed. You showed me that love is not about giving up your strength, but about sharing it with someone who respects and honors it. I love you more today than I did 38 years ago, and I will love you more tomorrow than I do today. There was not a dry eye in the crowd as Yates stood and pulled Margaret into his arms, kissing her to thunderous applause and cheers. "I love you, Margaret Miller Owens," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You are the strongest, bravest, most incredible woman I have ever known, and I am the luckiest man alive because you chose to let me stand beside you." The years continued to pass, each one bringing new joys and challenges. Margaret and Yates grew older together, their bodies slowing but their spirits as strong as ever. They still took their morning coffee on the porch, still held hands as they walked through the ranch, still looked at each other with the same love and devotion that had sustained them through decades of life together. In 1925, as they approached their 40th wedding anniversary, Margaret became ill. It started as a persistent cough that would not go away, progressing into something more serious. The doctor diagnosed pneumonia and prescribed rest, but Margaret, stubborn as always, refused to slow down more than absolutely necessary. Yates, terrified of losing her, became her constant companion. He sat by her bedside when she needed to rest, brought her meals and medicine, read to her from the books she loved. Their children and grandchildren came to visit, filling the house with love and laughter that Margaret insisted was better medicine than anything the doctor could prescribe. Slowly, with Yates's devoted care and her own fierce determination, Margaret recovered. The illness left her weaker than before, more aware of her mortality, but also more grateful for every day she had with the people she loved. On their 40th wedding anniversary in November 1925, they had a quiet celebration at home with just their immediate family. Margaret was still recovering her strength, but she insisted on dancing with Yates to the music that William played on the piano. As they swayed together in the living room, surrounded by their children and grandchildren, Margaret whispered, "Thank you for saving my life all those years ago, and thank you for continuing to save it every day since then." "You saved mine too," Yates whispered back. "We saved each other." That is what love does. They continued dancing, two people who had fought through impossible odds to build a life together, whose love had created a legacy that would endure for generations. Outside, the ranch that had been the center of their struggles and triumphs spread out under the stars, a testament to what could be achieved when two people stood together as equals, as partners, as soulmates. Margaret fully recovered from her illness by the spring of 1926, and she and Yates had several more good years together. They watched their great-grandchildren being born, saw the ranch continue to prosper under the next generation's management, and enjoyed the quiet contentment that came from a life well lived. On a crisp autumn morning in 1930, very much like that first morning when Yates had appeared on Margaret's porch nearly 50 years before, they stood together watching the sun rise. Margaret was 69 now, Yates 74, and they had been married for 44 years. "I still love you as much as I did that first day," Yates said, his voice rougher with age but still full of warmth. "More, actually. How is that possible after all these years?" "Because love is not something that fades with time when it is real," Margaret said, leaning against him. "It grows and deepens and becomes part of who you are. You are part of me, Yates. You have been since that first morning when you stood on this porch and refused to leave me alone to face the darkness." "Best decision I ever made," Yates said, kissing the top of her silver head. "Standing on your porch that morning, waiting to see if you would shoot me or hear me out." Margaret laughed. "I am glad I chose to hear you out." They stood together as the sun climbed higher, painting the world in gold and amber light. The ranch awakened around them, carrying on the rhythms and traditions they had established so many years ago. Their legacy was not just in the land and the cattle and the buildings. It was in the love they had built, in the family they had raised, in the example they had set of what a true partnership could be. And every morning, for the rest of their long lives together, Yates stood on that porch at dawn, keeping the promise he had made nearly 50 years before. To stand beside Margaret, to protect what they had built together, to never let her face the world alone. And every morning, Margaret joined him, grateful beyond words for the cowboy who had appeared when she needed him most, and had stayed beside her through every joy and sorrow life could bring. Their story became legend in Malad City and beyond, told to children and grandchildren as an example of true love, real partnership, and the kind of courage it takes to build something lasting. The ranch they had fought so hard to keep remained in the family for generations, a living monument to Margaret and Yates, and the love that had conquered every obstacle placed in their path. They lived into their 80s, dying within 6 months of each other as if neither could bear to be without the other for long. They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking the ranch, their graves marked with simple stones that bore their names and a single line, "Together, always." And on that hill, if you visit on a quiet morning when the sun is just beginning to rise, you can almost see them. A woman rancher and the cowboy who stood on her porch every morning, standing together still, watching over the land they loved and the legacy they built through courage, determination, and a love that conquered everything in its path.